You may have seen some amazing pieces being used in movies or by your favorite content creator and thought, where do I even start with something like that? Well, you're in the right place because this is your crash course in foam latex prosthetics. We'll cover how to prep it, some must-know techniques for gluing, even fixing those little mishaps and bad edges, painting, also how to take it off, and maybe how to reuse it. So what is foam latex? Think of it as the lightweight, squishy brother of regular latex. For decades, it's been the backbone to create movie monsters and even some character transformations. It is not just for makeup, it is also used in animatronics and even costumes. Since it's really flexible and moves really well with the skin, it gives a more realistic effect than plain old latex. Even though silicone has kind of taken the top slot of being a favored material,
same plans I get.
Foam is still being used in film and is a great material to create characters. As far as cost, foam is typically cheaper than silicone, but the more high-end foam pieces are still gonna cost you a bit. The biggest drawback for some is, well, it has latex. So if you have a latex allergy, this really isn't a material you wanna be gluing onto your face. Foam latex is created with whipping a few chemicals together and baking in a mold. Sounds simple enough, but this is not something you wanna be making at home. Making foam requires dedicated equipment like the mixer and a specialty oven, and not that oven in your kitchen. You do not want to be baking an ammonia-based concoction in the same oven that you cook your food. And speaking of ammonia, new foam pieces can often be, well, pungent. Some manufacturers don't even wash the pieces once they take it out of the mold. So if your new piece is a little smelly, you should definitely wash it before gluing it onto your or someone else's face. Just gonna use some soap like Dawn and some lukewarm water. And you wanna be really careful. You don't wanna twist and wring it out like laundry. You'll end up tearing those delicate edges. You wanna gently squeeze the thicker parts to really work that soapy water in. Rinse it really well. Press that excess water out with your hands. Make sure to focus on the thicker parts. Then you can use a towel, either paper or fabric, and press even more water out. You can lay it flat on a clean towel or a face form and just let it air dry. This could take hours or even overnight, so you just want to be patient because you want the piece to be completely dry before you glue it onto anything. And there still might be a slight smell that lingers, but it should definitely smell a lot better than before. Oh, I should probably mention, this is not a good method. If you have an old used piece and you're hoping just to wash the old paint off of, there's a much better fix for that. We'll get into it later. Now your piece is smelling a little fresher and now it's time to apply. But if you're hoping to reuse this piece, you might want to consider some prep. What makes a good prosthetic blend into the skin is those really thin edges. And when you go to remove the makeup, those usually don't survive. But you can do your best to protect them by adding a little bit of latex to the inside of the prosthetic. To really protect it, I would coat the entire inside with a thin layer. But if you are sweaty or tend to overheat, I wouldn't recommend doing this. In that case, you would just want to stick to the outer edges. That's gonna leave the rest of the foam completely untouched because the foam will help absorb the moisture from your sweat and help to keep that glue from coming undone. That latex layer is going to block its ability to absorb and it could reactivate that glue, and then the glue is just gonna lose its stickiness and that piece is gonna fall off your face. Speaking of sticking to your skin, let's talk glue. Spirit gum might be the most recognizable of the FX glues. It's always an amber color and you usually see it around Halloween time. Nice thing is it's cheap, but honestly, for foam latex, I'd avoid it. It's a little more rigid than most adhesives on the market, so it's not the best for movement. It is alcohol-based, so it can be a little harsh on people with more sensitive skin. And also another ingredient in the glue is a gum from a tree. So there are people who may find they have an allergy to this. The best use for spirit gum is really for handling hair, applying hair pieces, or prepping skin for wax buildups. Then you have silicone adhesives like Telesis. Those are typically a two-part system, and of course they're better for silicone appliances. They're water resistant, so it makes it a really great option if you're really sweaty or working in a wet environment. or you just really want that makeup to last for hours. But before you throw this glue into your cart, there are some drawbacks. Silicone adhesives tend to be on the pricier side. They can still be a little harsh for some people with sensitive skin. And also you need to take extra care to remove them and not to damage the skin. The good news is, more than likely, you're not gonna need to grab for this when working with foam latex. Majority of the time, acrylic adhesives is all you need. Those are gonna be glues like Prosaide and Beta Bond. They're water-based, an opaque white that dries clear. They have a low allergy risk, and there's no harsh fumes. Though with anything new you're trying on your skin, definitely recommend a patch test. Because it's water-based, heavy sweating might reactivate the glue and causing it to lose its sticking power. But there's a few more tricks before you run off and grab that silicone adhesive. One is prepping the skin with antiperspirants. Those are gonna be like Mayron Skin Prep Pro or PPI Dry. This will help to slow the sweating. Also, you may just need a little more glue. Using the double tack method where you apply it on the prosthetic and the skin may be all the extra holding power you need. Also, a really good benefit of this glue is it's not only useful for gluing on prosthetics, there are multiple uses for it. But we'll talk about that later. Now we got our piece and grabbed our glue. Let's apply. But before anything, you're gonna wanna make sure the skin is ready. The area you're going to be applying it, you wanna make sure it's clean, free of oil, dirt, or makeups. This is also the point where you're gonna apply those skin preps like the antiperspirants that we just talked about. Or if you want an extra barrier because you have super sensitive skin, you can use something called DermaShield. That creates a thin barrier between the glue and your skin, so it helps to protect it if you're constantly wearing makeup day to day and the removal process might make your skin a little raw. This stuff is just gonna add a little bit extra protection, but it's definitely not needed. We're gonna apply a full face foam latex prosthetic because those tend to be the trickiest. Since they're usually generic, which means they're just kind of created in a baseline face so that it can fit a multitude of faces. The problem is certain facial anatomy, you might find that it doesn't fit so well in certain areas. Say for instance, you have a smaller nose bridge like I do, you'll probably find that a lot of the prosthetics with full noses, you're not gonna fill it in. Now, you do not wanna slather the prosthetic and just slap it on your face. You wanna apply it in sections and keeping in mind certain important anchor points. The most important parts to line up is going to be the nasal area and the inner corners of the eyes. If those end up crooked, it's gonna end up really obvious in your final look. This is why starting in the center of the face is really important. You're just gonna lightly stretch the nose and get it into position and line up the nose corners. And you wanna line the inner corner of the eyes to make sure that the piece isn't overlapping your eye. Since foam does stretch, you can take your time and kind of pull it and manipulate it into the spots you need it to go. One issue I think a lot of people struggle with is actually using their glue improperly. Like just putting glue on, pressing down the piece, and then wondering why it's not holding. When you're using acrylic glues, if it's still white, it is not ready. The glue needs to dry for it to be sticky, so when it's clear, it's ready to use. You're either gonna want to dry it with a fan or blow dryer, or just kind of buff it in and help to speed up the drying process. Now, when you're gluing around the eyes and the cheekbones, you're gonna wanna lightly pull it and just keep an eye on the edges for any unwanted buckling or folds. And take your time to line up the upper mouth so that it doesn't look strange once it's glued. The lower part of the face, it's good to actually start with the chin and then line up the bottom lip. That way the bottom face won't end up crooked and look weird, because if you go and apply one side first, you might realize it's not where it's supposed to be. Once you get the main part glued down, you can then focus on the edges. One good tool is bent tweezers. It allows you to get in and pull the edge up so you can get the glue under there without getting your hand all in somebody's face. Now, this tool is definitely probably more handy if you're working on somebody versus working on yourself. There's also areas where you can take your hand and lightly pull the prosthetic down, and that's just gonna lift it up enough for you to get the glue brush in there. Now, laying edges can be a sticky process, and it's best not to use your fingers because then they might end up sticky and you'll start sticking and could rip up an edge. So one technique to try is rolling the edge down with your brush. You're just gonna wanna put a little powder on the end of the brush and then gently roll it flat. Also, using a brush is a great way to push in a tiny little spot as opposed to using your finger. When gluing around the mouth, you're gonna wanna make sure to powder as soon as you're done, because if the model closes their mouth and there's still some sticky areas, they could open their mouth and it would stick together and it could rip that area. And I really wouldn't recommend a powder brush for this area because you might end up putting a ton of powder in the poor person's mouth. So something like this stomper or even a powder puff is better so that you can press the powder down. Now, as far as the bent brush, it's similar to those bent tweezers. It just kind of helps keep your hand out of your line of sight while you're working. The stomper, the bent tweezers, and the bent glue brush, these are absolutely not required. These are just tools you might want to experiment down the road, see if you like them, and you might want to add them into your workflow. When you glue around the eyes, make sure to tell the model to keep their eyes closed because you don't want the eyelashes or eyelid to get stuck before it gets powdered. Now, no matter the material your prosthetics are made out of, edges are always the hardest part. We all want those beautiful blended edges, but a lot of people just aren't putting in the right amount of time. It's important to slow down and make sure there's enough glue to keep your edges down. And you don't want any unwanted wrinkles. You can have a prosthetic with the world's best edges, but if you apply it haphazardly, it's just not gonna look good. You're just gonna get better with practice and start to have the ability to fix issues. You were applying the piece and you didn't realize that a part had folded over and now it's glued down to the skin and you can't just grab it and pull it up. You're gonna rip that prosthetic. Since we're using acrylic glue, I'm just gonna take a little bit of alcohol and a brush, and it's just enough to get the brush wet. You don't want it soaking and dripping and ending up getting alcohol running down the poor person's face. You're gonna wanna carefully work the areas above and below and work that fold out. If it starts to stick to the brush, just go ahead and add a little more alcohol. If you're using silicone adhesive, you're gonna go ahead and use the thinner instead of alcohol. Now remember, just take your time because you do not wanna rip this edge up. Once you get it up, you're gonna go ahead, just add some more glue and carefully lay it down. Now that it's all applied and the edges are all nice and glued, you're just gonna wanna go ahead and seal those edges. Gonna stipple some of that acrylic glue to help blend it further into the skin. You may have to do a couple coats on certain areas if the edge is slightly thicker. Now, if you're planning to reuse your prosthetic, I would actually use latex for this step because that's gonna be easier to get up versus using the glue. It's really gonna end up locking it down to the skin and you might find that you rip the edges up trying to remove it. But what if you have some edges that aren't blending with the stippling of the glue, or you even have a piece ripped out in your prosthetic? Well, remember what I said, acrylic glues are kind of awesome because they have more than one purpose? Well, that's where Bondo comes into play. For bigger gaps, tears, or even just needing a little more help to get that really beautiful blend, Bondo, or also called Cabopatch, is gonna be your best friend. It's basically thickened acrylic glue that has been mixed with Cabosil. You can buy it, but this is definitely cheaper and super easy to make at home. Cabosil is an extremely fine powdered silica that can get into the air very easily. So that means you want to move really slowly and carefully when using this. Also recommend to wear a mask. To make it, you're just going to add the Cabosil and the glue into a cup and gently and slowly fold it and try to get all of that powder saturated with some of the glue. Once there's no dry powder left, then you can start to mix a little more aggressively and get those lumps out. You're gonna wanna mix your glue into kind of a frosting consistency. This mixture should be stored in an airtight container. Just a tip, add a little bit of Vaseline onto the threading of your container. That way your lid won't end up gluing shut and then you're wrestling trying to get it open anytime you go to use it. Now let's put this stuff to use. You're gonna wanna take a spatula and apply it thinly into the gap to smooth out that transition. And try to smooth it as best as you can with the spatula. You wanna start out with a small amount of material because you only wanna fill that gap. You don't wanna get this stuff all over the place and then having more issues to fix later. You can then go and smooth it with water and a soft brush. Do not use alcohol. Alcohol is going to make the Bondo act strangely and start to clump. As you're working, be sure to constantly be rinsing off your brush and getting that excess product off. Though if you're working and you find that the bristles are sticking together and the brush is starting to cause texture you don't want, you can go ahead and wash the brush with some alcohol to break down the glue and get those bristles nice and soft again. But if you're planning on getting back to patching, just make sure you take some fresh water and rinse the brush off before getting back to work. Bondo dries clear and it does shrink a little, so you might find certain areas you might need a couple layers. Along with fixing edges and tears, you can also use Bondo for texture. Say you have a texture in the prosthetic, but you want to bring it into a bald cap. You can take an orange stipple sponge and some Bondo and create some cool texture. If you want some softer texture, you can use a red stipple sponge. And if you want even more soft and subtle texture, skip the Bondo and just use that red stipple sponge with some of the glue. Okay, we're applied, patched, and powdered down. No matter what makeup you decide to use to paint your prosthetic, sealing it is going to help you. By sealing it, it's going to prevent your paints from cracking while moving or stretching the face. It also stops the foam from slurping up that makeup and causing a weird color shift on the areas you painted on the foam versus non-absorbent areas like the skin. Now you can go ahead and just use a thin layer of that acrylic adhesive you're using, or you can use something called PAX Paint. That is an equal part acrylic paint and acrylic glue. Now PAX might feel a little advanced for some. That's totally fine. You do not need PAX to create awesome characters. The real advantage to using it comes into play if you're going for realistic skin tones, because that nasty pale yellow base really is not a good starting point. But there's another use for PAX. Even if you're a beginner, you might be interested in. Remember when we were talking about how washing a used prosthetic to get that old paint off just really wasn't a great idea? You can just mix PAX into whatever color you want and apply it over that used prosthetic, and that's just gonna cover the old makeup and basically just give you a blank canvas to do your next makeup on. Okay, so your makeup looks awesome. You went to your party, you got your pictures, you got your video. Now it's time to take it off. And just like the glues, the removers are not all created equal. Oil-based, such as isopropyl myristate, is probably the most common remover thrown around when you hear anybody talking about FX removers. This stuff is cheap, gentle, moisturizing, works great to break down glues and makeup. It sounds amazing, right? Not so fast. If you plan to reuse your foam latex prosthetic, stay away from this stuff, because the oil will soak into the foam and it's gonna cause issues when you go to try to reapply it. Also know that it can leave a residue on your skin that can last into the following day. So if you're trying to use glue on your skin or even just apply regular everyday makeup, you might find stuff's acting a little weird because of this oily residue. So if you're looking to reuse your prosthetic, that leaves us with the other type of remover. Those are solvent-based. Those are gonna be your Spirit Gum Remover, Bond Off, and Super Solve. They don't leave an oily residue, so these are gonna be the best if you plan to reuse your piece. These do use solvents, but they are formulated for the skin, but certain ones can still be a little harsh on sensitive skin. I have seen sensitivities to Bond Off. I even personally have sensitivity to PPI Super Solve, but my go-to remover is Super Solve Plus. That is a gentler formula of the original Super Solve, and it still does really great job of breaking down the glue and the makeup without having to worry so much about it feeling like it's burning your skin. But as I said before, with anything you're introducing to your skin, A patch test is always good because everybody's skin is different, so you might have different experiences. Time to take that sucker off. And no, please do not just rip it off. You could definitely damage your skin. Patience is key. So you're gonna wanna grab your remover. In my case, of course, I'm using Super Solve Plus. And you're also gonna wanna grab some brushes. For these, you want them to be dedicated to just removers. So I like to just pick up some cheap ones from an art store. That way, you can just get a whole bunch of different sizes for different uses. Also want some wipes or tissues. And you just wanna start by saturating the edge with the brush and just give it a chance to kind of work in and start to break the glue down to release the edge. Once you get an area that you can kind of work your brush under there, you're just gonna slowly keep adding more remover under the prosthetic. And you should let the remover dissolve the glue. You should not be pulling it off. You're just gonna kind of hold it up, and the remover should be doing all of the work and releasing the prosthetic as you work. There's a saying that it should take as long to remove it as it took to apply it. And that's really just a long way of saying, take your time. This is real-time footage of how slow this process can actually take. Once it's off, you're just gonna wanna go over the skin with a little more remover just to get rid of any of that leftover glue. At this point, you can use some wipes to help clean up the skin, or even a warm towel for a bit of a spa treatment, but obviously that's not required. Now you might be looking at the prosthetic after the remover and it's all swollen and misshapen, but that's totally normal and fine. You're just gonna wanna powder the back so that it doesn't stick to anything you don't want it to. Put it away in a safe area to dry overnight. When you come back to it, it should look a lot more like it did when you originally applied it. Now we just briefly touched on orange and red stipple sponges. Did you know they were also really good for painting? Check out the next video to see how you can level up your FX looks and get these super easy, realistic textures with sponges.